As wildfires have raged across the West, forcing thousands to evacuate their homes, census takers are facing new challenges.
Most of the time that I was actually working as an enumerator, it was in the high 90s, and we were getting this god-awful smoke. So you had to wear the mask for the pandemic, and then you're out there in this god-awful temperature, and then you've got the smoke. It was hell.
We spoke with one former census worker, an enumerator tasked recently with going door to door in smoky California. The Census Bureau does not let employees speak to the media, so she requested anonymity.
There were some people who would say, I'd love to be able to answer more of your questions. I think you've got the majority of everything, but the smoke is getting in my house now. Would you mind if I close the door and, we could talk through the window or something?
It's not just the fires out west, but also hurricanes in the southeast. Laura last month, Sally this month. Powerful storms making it hard for census takers to visit the households that have not answered their questionnaires. Tim Olson, the Census Bureau's Associate Director for Field Operations, admits natural disasters are a big problem.
I'm feeling challenged today. Will we successfully meet the deadline? Not in the majority of the states. We're absolutely going to meet in almost every state. But with the wildfires and with the hurricanes that we've had in the Gulf Coast area, we are challenged to complete all of the enumeration in a handful of states by our current deadline.
What happens if you can't meet the deadline in some of those places, especially where we've seen hurricanes and wildfires?
Well, we are bringing in a lot of extra resources, people, boots on the ground, so that we can meet that deadline. It's going to be tight. It's going to be challenging, but I don't know what happens if we don't meet the deadline. We really are investing every possible resource we can to make sure we get the job done. And I got to tell you, it's not rushing it. It's rather having enough people on the ground to be able to get it done properly.
Joe joins us live now. Joe, that deadline for collecting all of the census data has changed a few times. Where does it stand right now?
So let's imagine for a moment that there was no pandemic this year. Had that been the case, they would have stopped doing the counting, stopped going door to door at the end of July. Clearly, that wasn't the case. And because of the pandemic, they weren't able to go door to door for quite a few months. So the deadline changed initially to Halloween, October 31st, but then suddenly it moved up a month earlier to September 30th, which is where we're at now. So why was that the case? Well, here's the deal. In addition to doing all the counting, the Bureau also has to process all that information and then report it. And it has to do that by the end of the year, December 31st. That deadline still hasn't changed. Congress has not voted to change that deadline, so there's a huge time crunch there. That's why many are calling for a deadline extension. They're saying, hey, maybe you can count for an extra month and then process that information and actually report the numbers early next year. In fact, there are 4 former Census Bureau directors who've written a letter basically saying, let's do that. They say that they are worried that a fast count will lead to seriously incomplete enumerations. Allison?
Joe, there are also some lawsuits to get that deadline extended as well. Who's behind them and what are their biggest concerns?
Yeah, so there are some cities and civil rights groups that are behind the lawsuits. In fact, there's a hearing for one happening in California today. There's also one on the East Coast. A lot of this comes from communities of color that are worried that they're the ones who are going to get undercounted if the census moves too quickly, and there's a big impact if you're undercounted. That could impact funding. It could impact congressional seats. So they would like to see that deadline extended to try and ensure that things are accurate. On the flip side, you have the government saying, hey, listen, if we go and continue doing the counting till October 31st, and we only have 2 months to process all that information and turn in the final data, that's not enough time. But at the end of the day, it could very well be a court that decides whether the census counting comes to an end next week or whether another month or some other period of time is added to the count. Allison?
All right, it is such important information for us to have. We will certainly stay tuned to see what happens. Joe, thanks a lot.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.